This is Keesup Choe, and my guest today is Ann Dery, who is the head and director of global travel and meetings at S&P Global. Welcome.
Thanks, Keesup. Thank you very much for having me here today.
So during this lockdown period, I'm sure you've been very busy and actually looking at strategy and strategic initiatives. And can you kind of talk about what you've been involved with and what some of those initiatives might be?
Sure.
Yeah.
Sure. Well, I think early on, like most travel managers, I went through a few weeks of just complete fear that I had lost my total purpose, considering the program was now suspended indefinitely. But very quickly, probably starting in April, I would say, a lot of industry webinars started to be offered that really focused on the return to business travel and kind of wrapping our heads around what that concept is going to look like in the short term as well as the long term. And then I got very involved in that entire framework build out. I think it was in May. I went to my direct management and said, I know this sounds a bit far-fetched, but we actually have to start thinking about a return to business travel that's not going to look like what it did in 2019. Our whole program is going to have to change because of this new kind of very excessive layer of duty of care that we have to consider during a pandemic. And we also have to take into consideration that different regions are going to come back to travel faster than others because, we're almost following the trajectory of the pandemic itself. And, initially this was, I think the whole concept of the return to business travel framework was very esoteric for my management. But when I kind of put that into the context of we have to follow the pandemic, it started in Asia, it's, diminishing in Asia, then Europe, and then, the Americas. They really started to grasp that the program was going to come back slowly and very differently than it was in the past. So that that entire development of the framework led to a task force being created. I led the task force. I had colleagues from global security, from the people team, from facility management. And it also gave, that experience gave me exposure to other executives and other stakeholders that I had never worked with before. For instance, the facility management people, our site managers. In a normal travel program, I never really had to speak with the site managers. But, during the pandemic, the site managers really became the gatekeepers of all of our office locations. And they became the people in charge of who could enter the building and creating all the protocols we needed in place for COVID-19. And it was essential that they be part of the discussion about this new back to travel framework. So over the summer, we worked on the framework, and then I presented it again to our operating committee, which had now turned into this COVID-19 steering committee. And we went to the global security, and I presented together, and we actually had to present twice because the first time, unbeknownst to us, they had not received our PowerPoint in advance of the presentation. So when they opened it up and started looking at it and the new process for approval and the new form I was suggesting, they had a litany of feedback. Then they had a lot of very good suggestions that, security and I had not considered. So then we went kind of back to the drawing board a bit and refined the process and the framework and went back to see them again in August, and they immediately approved it. And then came, how do we now communicate this in the most constructive way and least confusing way possible across the organization? Because what we didn't want to do was communicate it globally when, vast parts of the globe were not even traveling yet and probably would not be traveling in the near future. So we took a very regional, very localized approach and started communicating and coordinating with our corporate communication managers in each region to help us build out the communication plan for the return to business travel framework. So that really has taken up probably the last 6 to 9 months of my work. Much more complicated than I thought it was going to be. But again, it really changed the nature of my job. Instead of focusing so much on sourcing this year, it was more about reinventing travel and somewhat pivoting my own role and becoming a much more strategic stakeholder within the greater organization and these various working groups, the return to office working groups, because our return to travel framework had to align with the return to office framework. So, getting that alignment in place was also a bit complicated. So, so that's been my major focus. And then my second focus has been on data. It's been about the distribution of the story.